You know, every once in a while, someone says something that completely changes the conversation. Not because they meant to, not because it was part of some carefully crafted marketing message. They just say something that makes you stop and think, wait a minute, did he really just say that? And I think that's exactly what happened with Garrett Langley, the CEO of Flock Safety. Now, I've covered flat cameras before, and I've covered automated license plate readers, connected cars, insurance companies buying your driving data, government surveillance, and just recently, signal trace, which takes vehicle identification to an entirely different level. I thought I had a pretty good understanding of where all of this technology was heading. And then I heard this interview, and honestly, I think the CEO just made one of the biggest mistakes of his career. Not because he misspoke, because I think he accidentally told us how the surveillance industry views the people asking questions. That's a big difference. He said the quiet part out loud. But before we continue, I want to remind you to like and subscribe and click that bell for notifications so you don't miss anything. We have a lot more coming on this subject. For years, we've heard the same message. These cameras are here to catch criminals. They're here to recover stolen cars. They're here to make neighborhoods safer. That's the sales pitch. And to be fair, these systems have helped solve crimes. Nobody is arguing that criminals shouldn't be caught. That's not what this discussion is about. And frankly, I get tired of hearing that used to shut down every legitimate question about surveillance. You can support law enforcement and still ask where the line should be. And these two ideas are not mutually exclusive. The interview with the CEO from Flock Cameras took a turn when the discussion shifted away from technology and toward a group called DFlock. Until a few days ago, most people never even heard of them. And if I walked into a room with 100 people and asked who DFlock was, I'd be 99% sure that none of them had a clue. I certainly hadn't spent much time looking at them because, frankly, they weren't driving the conversation. Well, they are now. Before I tell you why, I want you to hear Garrett Langley's comments yourself. Exactly what he said. And this is important. I don't want anyone saying his words were taken out of context or edited to fit a narrative. Listen to what he said exactly, and then we'll talk about it. I've listened to this interview several times, and here's what jumped out to me. Everywhere and increased surveillance everywhere. There's an organization called DLOC who, semi-well-known now, I guess, if you're interested in this stuff, who take a fairly aggressive approach in terms of counting the number of cameras and having a Discord channel where they talk about potential, activities to move against Flock and stop it expanding. What do you think of that organization and the way they go about their business?
Yeah, so I think there's really two groups of activists. You've got organizations like the ACLU and the EFF who take an above-board approach to fight for their point of view. And thankfully, we live in a beautifully democratic, capitalistic country where we can fight in court. And I have a lot of respect for those groups because they have reasonable debates and we follow the law. And then unfortunately, there's terroristic organizations like DOC whose primary motivation is chaos. They are closer to ANTIFA than they are anything else. And that, I think, is unfortunate because we don't want chaos, or I don't want chaos. I like law and order.
I like a society that has a bedrock of safety. So for those groups, I think it's just disappointing that they haven't chosen a more constructive mannerism to try to get what they want, which they have a right to have. But that's why we have a democratically elected process, right? Like, we're not forcing Flock on anyone. Elected officials know that as a community, you want to be safe. As a family, you want to be safe. And Flock is the best way to create a safe community.
Not sure DFlock would agree with the terroristic label that you put on them, but okay, let's start with the facts because I'm not interested in exaggerating the story. Garrett Langley didn't say everyone who criticizes Flock is a terrorist. He did not say everyone sharing camera locations is a terrorist. That's simply not true. And if we're going to criticize someone, we should criticize them for what they actually said and not what social media wishes they had said.
What he did say is that DLOC is a terroristic organization. Those are his exact words. Now here's where my antenna went up. Who exactly are these dangerous people? Seriously, if you're going to use a word that carries that kind of weight, I'd like to know who you are talking about. So I started digging. What I found wasn't what I expected. DLock isn't a group hacking police computers or breaking into government databases. They're not attacking officers. They're not disabling cameras. They're not carrying out acts of violence. What they are doing is documenting where these flock cameras are located and publishing that information on a public map using photographs, public record requests, local government documents, and information submitted by volunteers like you. That's what they're doing. And you can agree with them or not. I think it's a great idea, actually. Why not let people know where they are? But let's be honest about what they actually are doing. The entire argument comes down to transparency. If surveillance cameras are mounted on public roads, often purchased with your taxpayer dollars and watching the public, then the public should know exactly where they are. That's the philosophy behind DFlock. Flock sees it differently. The company argues that making camera locations easier to find could help criminals avoid those cameras, making the technology less effective. That's a legitimate concern and one that deserves to be part of the discussion. But if you're a police officer trying to catch a car thief, you probably don't want that thief to know exactly where all these cameras are located. Fair enough. But here's where the whole thing starts falling apart for me. These cameras aren't hidden. They're mounted on utility poles and attached to traffic lights. They're sitting beside roads that thousands of people drive by every single day. If I notice one while I'm driving and I tell my neighbor it's there, have I suddenly become part of the terroristic organization? That's not a sarcastic question. Where exactly is the line? Because if documenting publicly visible infrastructure is now considered dangerous, we're entering into some new, very strange territory. The more I researched this story, the less interested I became in Garrett Langley's comments, and the more interested I became in what they revealed. I kept coming back to the same question. Why does transparency create this kind of reaction? Why would a company that says it's making communities safer be so uncomfortable with people knowing where publicly visible cameras are installed? And that question led me to DFlock's website, their public map, and eventually to another site called haveibeenflocked.com. And there's a lot of others out there. The name alone tells you something has changed. There are other websites too, and all of them tell you where the multiple brands of cameras are located, and I have no issue with that. Think about it. 5 years ago, almost nobody was asking whether they had been entered into a surveillance database. Today, enough people are asking that someone built an entire website around the question. That's a remarkable shift. And I don't think it happened by accident. Maybe it's all about those gigantic data centers popping up everywhere for no reason. People are beginning to realize that these cameras aren't simply reading license plates anymore. Their technology has evolved. Artificial intelligence can now identify vehicles' make, model, color, roof racks, aftermarket wheels, bumper stickers, body damage, and countless other characteristics. Even if your license plate isn't visible, modern AI can often narrow the search down dramatically. And that's where the story gets much bigger. Because once you understand what the system is capable of today, Garrett Langley's comments take a completely different meaning. And this isn't just a debate over a map of camera locations. It's a debate over transparency at a time when surveillance technology is becoming exponentially more powerful every single year. And that's where another thought hit me. Over the past several months, we've talked about connected cars collecting data. We've talked about insurance companies purchasing driver information. And just last week, we covered Signal Trace and its ability to identify vehicles through electronic devices through Bluetooth as you traveled inside those zones. At the time, those seemed like separate investigations. I don't think these are separate stories anymore. I think these are chapters within a very large dystopian model. And this is where it really gets interesting. The more I dug into Flock, the more I realized this isn't really about one company or one CEO. It's about an entire ecosystem that quietly expanded around us, often with very little public discussion. Once I started following the money and looking at how these systems are funded and how they end up in communities across America, I realized this investigation was much bigger than I expected. And that's where we're heading next. Because once I started following the money, I realized this story isn't just about flock safety. It's about how surveillance technology quietly becomes a part of everyday life without most people ever realizing how it got there. Let's start with some questions. How did thousands of AI-powered surveillance cameras suddenly appear all over America? Did your city put it on the ballot? Did taxpayers vote on it? Did your county hold a series of public meetings explaining exactly what these cameras were capable of doing and what data would be collected? Who would have access to it and how long it would be stored? Maybe your community did. I'm guessing none of that happened. Instead, as usual, it was passed in a bill in the middle of the night and no one read it. No surprise there. The claim is that police departments need ways to identify criminals. A vendor approaches the agency or is related to a politician or a lobbyist, pushes for this to be added to a bill at the last second. Grant funding is discussed, federal money becomes available, and the local cost suddenly looks much smaller. And before long, another no-bid contract is signed. Another group of cameras goes up, and another community joins a rapidly expanding surveillance network, and no one is the wiser. That's how these systems spread. One contract at a time, one grant at a time, one community at a time. Most people never know the discussion even happened. It may not have happened at all, and it was just added to a bill. Then in short time, the cameras were already mounted on poles before you even know it. One of the biggest accelerators came from the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, which was signed in 2021 by President Joe Biden. Now, let's be accurate because this matters. The law did not create flock safety, and it did not specifically direct money to flock. What it did do was significantly expand funding available to state and local governments through the various grant programs that could be used for public safety technology. And once those fund streams opened, communities suddenly had access to far more federal dollars for projects they might have otherwise had difficulty funding. And they had to justify it through local budgets alone. Well, now the money comes from the federal government. Here's what always amazes me. People pay taxes expecting roads to be repaired, bridges to be maintained, and dangerous intersections to become safer. Very few taxpayers probably imagine some of the same funding streams would help expand AI-powered surveillance systems throughout their communities. Now, whether you support flock or oppose it isn't really the issue. The issue is whether people knew it was happening. That's called transparency. And we already know the answer to this. They just go ahead and do it. The more I researched this, the more I found city council meetings where residents were asking questions about contracts that had already been negotiated. Some communities embraced the technology, others pushed back, and some renewed contracts without much debate. Others decided not to continue using the system after hearing concerns from citizens. So, your voice does matter. And that's exactly how local government is supposed to work. People ask questions, elected officials answer them. Contracts are debated in public, and citizens decide whether the benefits outweigh the concerns. In this case, most times it didn't happen. What surprised me wasn't some communities rejecting flock. What surprised me was how many people had no idea these cameras had been installed in the first place. And that brings us back to DLOC. When Garrett Langley criticized the organization, I don't think he intended to make them more influential, but he did exactly that. Before this interview, relatively few people knew who DFLAC was, and if they even existed. Now a lot of people know who they are. Now thousands of people are looking at their maps, reading the material, and asking questions they probably wouldn't have asked otherwise. The attempt to discourage the transparency often creates more transparency. Then I found something else that really caught my attention. This isn't just happening in the United States. Across Europe, particularly in parts of England and France, there have been repeated incidents involving surveillance cameras being vandalized, removed, or destroyed. Similar situations have happened here in the United States. Let me be perfectly clear because I don't want anyone misunderstanding what I'm saying. I do not support vandalizing public or private property, and if someone cuts down a camera pole or destroys equipment, they're committing a crime. But here's what I also think would be a mistake: pretending that these crimes don't tell us something. People don't suddenly wake up one morning and decide they're angry at surveillance technology for no reason. Something has changed. There's a growing frustration among many people who believe the surveillance has expanded faster than public conversations surrounding it. Whether they're right or wrong, that frustration is real. And dismissing everyone as anti-law enforcement or somehow opposing public safety completely misses the point. Most people I talk to aren't against catching criminals. They're against living in a society where every new technology quietly collects more information than the last one. While anyone asking questions is treated as if they're standing in the way of public safety, that's a false choice. You can support law enforcement and want stolen cars recovered. You can want violent criminals arrested and also believe transparency matters. Those positions are not mutually exclusive. This is where I started thinking about my signal trace investigation. When I covered signal trace, one of the things that really struck me was how quickly surveillance technology has evolved. Remember when automated license plate readers did exactly what their name implied? They read license plates. That seems almost quaint now. Today's systems don't stop at license plates. Artificial intelligence recognizes the vehicle itself and recognizes color, make, model, body style, roof racks, bike racks, window tint, aftermarket wheels, visible damage, unique markings, and even your bumper sticker. Then, signal trace takes another step further by correlating electronic devices. What it does is it takes your Bluetooth signal from literally everything you have from your phone, from your AirPods, your dog's pet color, your health devices, from the rings and the bands and everything that we all have, and the center screen in your car and maybe people riding with you. Signal trace takes these Bluetooth signals and puts it all together so it knows more about you. Signal trace is a software application that goes to all the cameras that exist out there now, whether it be a flat camera or any ALPR. So it doesn't have to be when you're in a car. It could be walking down a road, when you're in a park. All that information gets together to create something called an electronic fingerprint. So it knows literally everything about you. Check out the previous video and you'll get more information. Think about how quickly that evolution happened. Most Americans think these systems are simply photographing license plates. They don't. The technology is moving much faster than the public conversation surrounding it. And that's one of the reasons Garrett Langley's comments mattered so much. Because if transparency becomes the enemy at exactly the same time surveillance cameras become dramatically more capable, we're asking citizens to place an extraordinary amount of trust in the systems they know very little about. Trust is earned. It isn't demanded. And companies don't build trust by dismissing or labeling the people as terroristic for asking reasonable questions or showing where cameras are located. They build trust by answering them. The problem is that every answer seems to create another question. Who owns the data? Who can search it? How long is it really stored? Can it be shared? Can it be sold? And can it be combined with other databases? And can artificial intelligence eventually predict where someone is likely to travel based on where they've been before? Those aren't science fiction questions anymore. Many of them are already being discussed inside the surveillance industry today. Which brings us to the question every taxpayer should be asking. If we're paying for these systems, who exactly is making the decisions on our behalf? Which brings me back to the question that started the entire investigation. How do we get here? It's not just about flock cameras. It's not just AI cameras. How did we get to the point where questioning surveillance is treated more with suspicion than the surveillance itself? I don't think it happened overnight. It happened one technology at a time, one grant at a time, one city at a time, one contract at a time, one software technology update at a time. And every step sounded reasonable and had a logical explanation at the time, and every step promised to make our communities a little bit safer. Standing alone, each decision probably didn't seem to be a very big deal, but when you step back and look at the entire picture, it's hard not to notice how dramatically things have changed in a relatively short period of time. Remember when license plate readers were exactly that? They read license plates. Now with artificial intelligence, they can do things today that weren't even part of the public conversation just a few years ago. Add in signal trace, which adds another layer of identifying your electronic devices traveling with you in your vehicle, even walking down the street. And the technology keeps evolving. But one thing doesn't seem to evolve at the same pace: the public conversation. And most Americans have no idea what these systems are capable of today, let alone what they're capable of 5 years from now. And that's why transparency matters. Not because everyone's against surveillance or distrusts the law enforcement. It's because transparency builds trust. And if technology is as valuable as companies claim, then it should be withstanding public scrutiny. It should survive difficult questions, criticism, and public debate. In fact, those discussions should make the technology better, not weaker. And that's why Garrett Langley's comments bothered me so much. Not because I expected every CEO to agree with its critics. That would be unrealistic. Healthy disagreement is part of a free society. What bothered me was the attitude behind the words. Calling people terroristic because they map publicly visible cameras doesn't answer a single question about surveillance. It doesn't explain how data is protected and who has access to it. Those policies will change in the future. It simply shifted the conversation away from the technology and toward the people asking the questions. And I don't think that's a smart way to handle this at all. Here's something else I think deserves far more attention. Whether your community has flock cameras or other ALPRs or not, everyone has more influence than you probably realize. Find out if your city or your county uses these systems. Ask how they were purchased with federal grant money that helped pay for them. Ask when the contract expires. Ask whether the contract will come back to you, the city council, or the county legislature. And ask what the retention policy is for that data. Ask who outside your local agency can search for that information. And ask whether the public was notified before the cameras were installed. Those aren't anti-police questions. Those are pro-accountability questions. Those aren't anti-police questions. Those are pro-accountability questions. This is where your power makes a huge difference. Asking these questions will give you the answers you need, and if they won't answer those questions, that's a huge statement in itself. Government works best when citizens are informed, engaged, and willing to participate. Too often, we don't learn about these technologies until after they're installed. The contracts are signed and the cameras, they're already watching traffic. By then, the conversation has shifted from, should we do this, to, well, they're already there. Too bad you're going to have to deal with it. It doesn't have to work that way. Attend a council meeting, read the agenda, file public records requests, talk to your local elected officials, support transparency regardless of where you stand on this technology itself. One thing I've learned covering the auto industry is that consumers have far more influence than they think. Automakers change course when buyers stop buying. Companies change policies when enough customers push back, and local governments respond when citizens actually show up. Sitting on the sidelines and assuming someone else is paying attention rarely produces good outcomes. There's another reason this story matters. Today we're talking about flock cameras. Tomorrow it'll be another company, and I'll be watching and listening, and you should too. The technology will continue evolving whether we pay attention or not. Artificial intelligence isn't slowing down. Vehicle connectivity isn't going away. Data collection isn't becoming less valuable. If anything, the opposite is true. The companies build these systems are investing billions of dollars because data has become one of the most valuable commodities in the world. And that's exactly why transparency has to keep pace. It's always about control and money, your money. I also want to be very clear about something else. Nothing in this report should be interpreted as encouraging anyone to damage cameras, interfere with law enforcement, or vandalize public property. I've shown you that there have been crimes in the United States, England, and France because they're part of the public reaction to expanded surveillance. They demonstrate that frustration exists. They do not represent the solution. The solution is an informed public. The solution is transparency. The solution is having these conversations before the next contract is signed, instead of after the cameras are already installed. So let's go back to where this investigation started. And then unfortunately there's terroristic organizations like DOG whose primary motivation is chaos. They are closer to Antifa than they are anything else. And that I think is unfortunate because we don't want chaos, or I don't want chaos. After everything we've covered today, I want you to think about those comments one more time. Maybe you agree with Garrett Langley. Maybe you think DLOC is irresponsible. Maybe you think publishing camera locations makes communities less safe. That's your right. Or maybe you believe transparency is an essential part of free society, that publicly installed surveillance technology should itself be open to public scrutiny. That's your right too. But whatever side you come down on, I hope you'll agree on one thing. The conversation is too important to end with just labels. There's a quote I thought about while researching this. Benjamin Franklin stated, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." Whether Franklin intended those words to apply to modern surveillance isn't really the point. The point is that every generation has to decide where the balance belongs between freedom, privacy, and security. That debate isn't new, but the technology certainly is. And Garrett Langley probably thought he was defending the company. Instead, I think he accomplished something very different. He started a conversation that millions of Americans weren't having before. And maybe that's the real story. If mapping flock cameras makes you a terrorist, what does that make the people putting the cameras everywhere? So, with all this information, what does that make us for discussing this topic? It's important that you talk to your friends and your families. Make sure to talk to your elected officials as well, because this is far from over. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe for more videos like this. And check out our car review channel, Car Smarts. You can support me by buying me a cup of coffee. And if you want even more content, check out the links in the description. I'm Lauren Fix.